Let us begin. So good afternoon again, everybody. This presentation is called The Art of Building the Slater Memorial Museum. And just as a little background to the presentation, this is sort of an adaptation of a class that we do with all of our museum docents. Our museum docents that volunteer here go through a rather rigorous multi-week training period. And this is one of the lectures talks about the history of building the actual Slater Memorial Museum. But I've gotten a lot of requests and feedback from people that saying that they want to hear a little bit more about the construction of the museum, how it fits in to the development of Norwich. So we wanted to do our next Zoom presentation on that topic specifically. So I am going to share my screen here so that I may bring up my presentation that I have. Okay. Okay. All right, so if everybody can see that, the screen, can everybody see that? Just either throw up a thumbs up or throw up a yes. Okay, great.
Yes.
Perfect, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. All right, the art of building the Slater Memorial Museum. This is a very special building, and there's a lot to talk about because when this building was constructed, it was the second building to be featured on the campus of Norwich Free Academy, and it was really a monumental addition to the campus. When the building opened up in 1888, it opened up not only to NFA, but also to the public. It was always originally supposed to be a resource, not just to Norwich Free Academy, but also to the public. And we know so much about the nature of constructing the building, as well as the history of the architect and the powers that be that were involved in creating the building. So what you're looking at right now is some of the original designs drafted by the museum's architect, Stephen Earle. This is from about 1886, showing the original design of the museum put to paper. And this presentation will be split into three main parts. We're going to talk about the history of this type of architecture, as well as the architecture that we see throughout Norwich during this time in the late 19th century. The second part will be exploring the history of the museum's architect, Stephen Earle, and then we'll talk about Slater Museum specifically with some of those really neat and interesting tidbits of the building. So I love showing period photographs of the museum. And this is a really interesting view. It's a view from behind. You normally always see photographs of the front of buildings or maybe on the side, but I like this one just because it's a view from behind. So what you're looking at is Slater Museum on the right-hand side of the photo. And on the left-hand side is the original Norwich Free Academy building, the old main building, as it was called. Of course, most of you are familiar with the fact that the old main building does not exist anymore. It was demolished in the early 1900s, and the Tyrrell building was constructed in its place. So one of the things about architecture that I love is it's something that almost anybody can really appreciate. And I say that because there's a lot of philosophy and technology involved. In fact, as a side note, when I was a kid, my dream was to become an architect. I loved building so much. And then I discovered I was really bad at math, and then that dream died very quickly. So that's my career as an architect that never happened. but in any event, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the philosophy behind it, particularly some insight that was that's been talked about by one of my favorite visionaries in the world of storytelling. His name is George Lucas. And if you're familiar with him, George Lucas created the franchise Star Wars. And he gave an interview to 60 Minutes some years ago talking about art. And I thought it was really particularly fascinating because George Lucas said, when it all comes down to it, art is technology. All art is technology. And I found that really insightful and fascinating because whether you're talking about studio art or architecture or anything of the such, it's technology that produces it. It's technology that actually makes it happen. Whether you're talking about the composition of paint, to the designing and constructing of a building, it's all technology in some way, shape, or form. And one of the examples that he uses is that he cites this building that you see, which I'm sure many of you recognize as the Florence Cathedral in Florence, Italy, also known as the Duomo. And he used this example because when this cathedral began construction in the late 13th century, it ended up sitting for over 100 years because the architects and the professionals of the time could not figure out how to create the dome of the building, which of course is arguably its most iconic feature. And the reason why that the architects and the professionals and the technology masters of the time couldn't figure it out is because no one had any knowledge of being able to create these domes. A lot of that knowledge sort of died out. But Brunelleschi, who was brought in to design this feature of the building, he says to himself, well, the ancient Romans knew how to create domed buildings. They created the Pantheon. And so as a result, there had to be a way to construct this dome. So he ended up engineering a number of ingenious solutions to construct the dome. And to spare me the embarrassment of having to explain it in detail, let's just say it's a combination of the materials he used as well as the engineering principles that allowed the weight of the dome to be evenly distributed all throughout. And so that's sort of the real Cliff Notes version of how he was able to complete the dome. But nevertheless, it was a problem that needed a solution, and he certainly created that solution. Going forward here, the Slater Memorial Museum is a representation of how the art and technology of back then influenced the art and technology we see today, and it's an evolution of how art and architecture was created so many years ago. When you look around Norwich, for example, Norwich is an architect's dream come true. We have so many different types of styles that reflect hundreds and hundreds of years of development. So during the 19th century was a particularly momentous century for architecture, because during this time we see the country rapidly changing. The country is rapidly industrializing in the major cities, and we start to see new classes of workers as well as self-made business owners that are creating an enormous amount of wealth and certainly growing the economy. As a result, we see an explosion of art and architecture all throughout the country. And I'll say a little bit ironically enough, these inspirations are derived from our European ancestors as well as and cousins all across the Atlantic. So the different types of architectural styles that we see would be reflected in some of the images you see here, whether it's Gothic revival or Queen Anne style. You see Italianate, Lombardic style, or even French Second Empire inspiration as well. Then you have other inspirations such as the Greek revival period, neoclassical designs, and of course the Romanesque revival that we're going to be talking about in just a moment. So I wanted to give you just a couple of examples of some of those architectural styles that we see throughout Norwich. So I picked out 4 houses that you can see in Norwich. And these 4 I picked out because they're sort of among my favorites, and they're also completely different from each other. They're not one looks exactly like the other. And I'm sure many of you will recognize these buildings. If you look in the top left-hand corner, that is the Teal House, right outside on Chelsea Parade near the museum. This home was constructed not in the 19th century, but in the late 18th century, 1789 to be exact. And it reflects what's known as the federal style of the time. Couple of features that you would look for when identifying the federal style would be sort of the even layer of windows that you see. You also see the windows are completely on top of each other. They're all arranged very symmetrically. The hipped roofs is another feature that you would see. And this type of style we see develop during what we call the federal period, sort of the very early years of our country, from about 1789 going up through the beginning of the 19th century. Then going onto the top right, during the early 19th century, we see the development of Greek Revival architecture. This was a nationwide movement, and so you can see examples all throughout the eastern seaboard. It would stretch. And this is an architectural style that we're borrowing from our ancient ancestors. So when you look at, say, the facade of this home, which is the Aiken House in Norwich, it looks just like the front of a Greek temple, whether it be the Parthenon, the Pantheon, or anything of the sort, with those columns as well as the pediment, the triangular pediment that you see up at the top. Going down to the bottom left is the Bill House, which was also a part of NFA at one point, as the Home Ec building. You might be familiar with it as the Home Ec building, perhaps, if you went to NFA years ago. This is designed in what's known as the Italianate style. And a couple of things that you look for when you identify a building like this is take a look at the roof line. The roof line is incredibly distinctive. Very large eaves extending from the roof line, as well as these ornamental brackets that you see. And the large curved windows, they're very, very tall, is another feature that you would look for. It's sort of cut off on the side here, but porches and porticos were another main feature that you would see on this particular design. Then in the bottom right would be an example of like the Gothic Revival style. This is the home of Charles Converse. Charles Converse ended up donating the money to build Converse Art Gallery, which is in the rear of Slater Memorial Museum, where we hold our temporary exhibitions. And this is a more ornamental design that would reflect the verticality of, say, the Gothic cathedrals of the medieval period. And one thing that all of these homes would share in common is the fact that these homes are displays. They're displays of wealth and prominence of these new millionaire classes that began to dot the landscape of Norwich and all throughout the country. And here's another home here that some might recognize. In fact, we can play a little game. Does anybody want to take a guess as to what this home is? Does anybody recognize it?
Mark Twain.
Oh, someone said it. Yep, it's the Mark Twain House in West Hartford. Another example of the kind of the high Gothic style, and it's incredibly ornamental. Norwich features many other homes that existed that would have bared a resemblance to this style, one of which doesn't exist anymore, but I have a picture of it coming up here. It's the Blackstone residence, where the Blackstone apartment building is located on Washington Street. This home is a little bit more of a, not necessarily stripped down, but a little more modest version, say, of that high Gothic style. And all of these are different. Like I said, not all of them are the same. And that's one of the reasons why I love this area so much, is that there's such a diversity in the design of these buildings. And Slater Museum is certainly no exception to that. The museum is designed in the Romanesque Revival style. So remember that, because I think that was even a Jeopardy question at one point. So it may come up again, you never know. The Romanesque Revival style largely dominated in the late 19th century, and it was an incredibly popular architectural style that we see for a number of types of buildings, and we're going to be looking at many different examples of these buildings. Stephen Carpenter Earle. Stephen Earle is the architect of Slater Museum, and he is also the designer, the architect of other buildings here in Norwich, and I'll point them out throughout the presentation. A little bit about Stephen Earle. He was born in Leicester, Massachusetts in 1839, and he ended up relocating to Worcester. Worcester, Massachusetts is where the largest concentration of his work is featured. And he designed almost exclusively in the Romanesque Revival style. Now, what is Roman about Romanesque Revival? How do we identify this particular style? There's a couple of different features that you can see. Arguably, the most notable one is the existence of the rounded arch. And I'll also clarify by saying too that the Romanesque Revival style harkens back to the days of the Roman Empire, but much of the early architecture that we see was produced sort of post-Roman Empire. And there are influences from other parts of Europe too. You can see examples of Norman influence, there's Germanic influence, and many others. But this rounded arch, this very broad, very large arch is indicative of this style. So there are quite a few examples of these ancient buildings. This architecture was responsible for a number of monasteries, churches, all throughout Western Europe. So these are just a couple of different examples of what they look like. Here's one in Palencia, Spain. And here's an example of a German design. This is early 1800s. This is the Munich train station. So again, you see, this is a great way to show you again the rounded archways, colonnades, arcades, as you would call them, as well as grouped columns and pilasters. All are features of this Romanesque Revival. Even the windows that you see, those rounded arched windows. This is not exclusive to the design, but some architects like to reflect symmetry in their designs. So some buildings, not all, will look very symmetrical to you, very easy on the eyes. This gentleman here, Henry Hobson Richardson, designed fairly exclusively in this Romanesque Revival style, to the point where his name is often associated with the movement. Richardsonian Romanesque is what you will hear. And we have a couple of his building designs that I'll show you in just a moment. Some of the buildings that exist that were so-called done in the Richardsonian Romanesque style aren't necessarily Romanesque. So just keep that in mind as the name was sort of loosely applied to buildings throughout the country. But these are some examples of Henry Hobson Richardson's designs. On the left is the Allegheny Courthouse in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Up in the top right here is Trinity Church in Boston. It's a great example of a heavily ornamental style, sort of a more Gothic influence that we see. And in the bottom right is known as the Glessner House in Chicago. He designed the home for James Glessner, one of the many industrial magnates of the time. And when the house was constructed, it sort of stuck out, not necessarily like a sore thumb, but it was very different than the other mansions that dotted the streets. And one of the funniest parts about it is one of Glessner's neighbors by the name of George Pullman, another big industrial magnate in Chicago. He apparently was not a big fan of the design. He thought it might have looked rather dull in some ways. So he was quoted to have said that, "I don't know what I did to deserve to have this thing staring me in the face every time I walk out my door." So sort of a great example of perhaps a first world problem in some ways. Here's an interior view of the Glessner house. Very rich features of wood, give you a very warm feeling when inside that space. So Stephen Earle ended up studying and working with some of the biggest names of American architecture during the time. So for a time he was in New York City and had studied and worked with this gentleman, Calvert Vaux, along with Frederick Law Olmsted. Calvert Vaux and Olmsted designed Central Park in New York City. That was one of their big claims to fame. Calvert Vaux was also a principal designer in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City as well. So as I mentioned, when Stephen Earle comes back to Worcester, Massachusetts, the largest concentration of his work is featured here. He designed 23 churches all throughout Worcester, and many other buildings too. It would take far too long to go over every single one of them, but I have a few examples here that I will illustrate to you. One of his biggest clients at the time was Worcester Polytechnic Institute. He designed several buildings on their campus in, of course, this Romanesque revival style. And so this is Boynton Hall that we see on the campus of Worcester Polytechnic Institute. He also designed the Magnetic Laboratory. This is 1887. I love this picture because I always say if you were to reduce the size of Slater Memorial Museum down to a miniature size, you'd probably get something that looks very similar to this building. It's almost like a miniature variant of it. Salisbury Laboratories on Worcester Polytechnic Institute as well. This was the same year in 1887. These, in this building here, Stratton Hall, these are sort of kind of stripped down versions of the Romanesque revival, so much less ornamentation as these buildings were purpose-built for utility purposes. He also designed the Worcester State Normal School. This is in 1895. And one of his other biggest claims to fame is the Worcester Art Museum in 1898. If you were to go driving by the Worcester Art Museum, it wouldn't look anything like this. This is what the original museum building looked like, but it has been heavily added onto and modified, so you don't necessarily see the original exterior facade of the building, but the interior features are still intact. One of the reasons I like this one is because this building in its original form bears sort of an uncanny resemblance, I think, to the Converse Art Gallery here at the Slater Museum. Between the roof lines as well as the arched windows as well, bears, I think, a very uncanny resemblance to our own Converse Art Gallery. Here's an interior shot of the Worcester Art Museum, and again, those grand colonnades of those very broad arches are a distinctive feature of that Romanesque revival style. Now, I mentioned Stephen Earle designed many churches throughout Worcester, Massachusetts, and these are just a few of them. And these are great examples to look at too, because he's not just working with, say, the Romanesque revival, but he's borrowing some other influences from other major landmarks and architectural styles from around the world. This is All Saints Episcopal Church in Worcester. This is Pilgrim Congregational Church, also in Worcester. And as you can see, there's many of these buildings do look a bit similar. The Friends Meeting House, also in Worcester, Massachusetts, sort of a scaled down version. And this is United Congregational Church. In terms of sort of the best buildings that Stephen Earle designed, this one I think is up there. Objectively speaking, the Slater Memorial Museum is really considered to be Earle's finest piece that he designed. But United Congregational Church certainly is up there in our opinion. As we're looking at these buildings, a couple things you want to bear in mind is these buildings all feature, similar as well as distinctive design elements, but material-wise, it's all uniform, at least in terms of appearance and color, between the brick and brownstone and granite. It's meant to create a unifying image that's very pleasing to the eye. It's not heavily ornamental to the point where it's distracting you, where you feel like you're looking at so many things at once. If you ever say visit the Newport mansions, those are heavily ornamental designs where you're looking all over the place, but not necessarily the case here. And one here in Norwich that Stephen Earle designed was Park Congregational Church, right across the street from Slater Museum. This predated the museum by about 10 years or so, if I'm not mistaken. He also designed buildings for Clark University. This was all around the same time that the museum was constructed. So this is 1887. And one of the things you notice about this building is he has incorporated an incredible amount of symmetry with this design, and as well as another specific architectural style. It's called the French Second Empire design. This was borrowed from the imperial period under Napoleon III during the mid-19th century in France. And when you look for the French Second Empire influence, the easiest thing to look for is all of the windows that you see are completely uniform. You can pick out every single level on this building because it's almost outlined very clearly for you. So all of the windows line up very, very well. All of the floors are all uniform in appearance. And if you want an example closer to home, you could go downtown in Norwich and see the Warregan. The Warregan building is a great example, again, of that French Second Empire influence. And just up the road from it, you will find another rather recognizable building in the Norwich City Hall. So again, these are designs that really, again, reflect the wealth and the prosperity that we're seeing come out of the late 19th century. Here are some other churches that Earle designed in Worcester. This is Union Congregational Church, and a great example of how he's borrowing inspiration from another very well-known landmark in France. It's Notre Dame. The Notre Dame Cathedral can certainly be seen in this design of Earle's Union Congregational Church. This is St. Matthew's Church, also in Worcester. And here's an interior shot of that church. So this is another, these are some other design details that you can look for with this particular style. The large vaulted ceilings, as well as the large vaulted domes in in the towers or in the main rooms of these buildings. Earle also designed the Worcester Free Library. And here are some other examples a little bit closer to home too. This is the Linden Building, located in Hartford. And again, symmetry as well as similarity in design between the different parts of the building is what makes the design so pleasing to the eye. So there's certainly a lot of uniformity when it comes to these features. And you have the People's Savings Bank, also in Worcester, Massachusetts. And this is an example of a private residence. The Romanesque revival wasn't necessarily the most popular when it came to designing private residences, but there are a few notable examples, such as the home of G.H. Whitcomb, 1879. And in the Jewett City, Connecticut, you will find the Slater Library, which was also designed by Stephen Earle. Again, right around the same time that the museum was finished in 1886, we see the Slater Library was also finished. And later in his life, Stephen Earle had experimented with different types of buildings, as well as different types of monuments. So these are a couple of designs known as the Bancroft Tower. He had designed this originally for the Worcester Art Museum. They didn't want it, so they gave it back to the city of Worcester to maintain. But it's a good example of how he began to experiment with different types of monumental designs later in his career. Hebrew Congregational of Washington, D.C. This is another example of that Romanesque revival style. And not just churches, but academia was a popular realm for the Romanesque revival to make itself known. So these are all university campuses throughout the country, as well as in Canada, that again reflecting the expansion of the country at the time. We're again seeing large expansion of the U.S. economy, as well as academia. So many of the universities that we see employ the use of the Romanesque revival style. So whenever you think to yourself about what the most important types of buildings you can make with this style is, churches, academic buildings, and museums. Again, you could certainly, you could almost interchange a building from one use to another. Some of you might recognize this as the Smithsonian Castle. This was done by James Renwick in the mid 19th century. This was a time where museums as a whole started popping up throughout the country. Some of the largest museums that we're familiar with today, such as the Smithsonian, the Metropolitan, and many others, see their start right around this time. Burnham and Root designed this building in Chicago. And I want to see if anybody recognizes this one. Does anybody recognize this particular building? This was designed by J.C. Cady. If you feel like you know the answer, feel free to throw it into the chat. We'll see if anybody recognizes it. Anybody recognize that building? I'll give you a hint. It's in New York City, and I wouldn't be surprised if many of you have visited this place, perhaps once or twice. Yes, this is the Museum of Natural History in New York City. This is the early wing. The museum is huge. This was the first. This was among the first. The early parts of the museum. So there's other buildings that comprise the museum. This is just the early parts. And here's another one here too. Does anybody recognize this building? If you do, feel free to throw it into the chat. This is actually one of my favorite buildings in Washington, D.C. That's a clue as to what the building is. Yep, it's the old post office building, and in my opinion, it's aside from maybe the White House, it's the most beautiful building in my opinion on Pennsylvania Avenue. It's also one of the tallest structures in D.C. Aside from a couple of utility towers, I think this is among the largest buildings. Present occupants aside, the building itself truly is a marvel. It's among my favorites in Washington, D.C. Okay. Here's another example of a private residence, the home of James Hill. This is done by Peabody and Stearns in St. Paul, Minnesota. And you can probably see why this wasn't exactly the most popular the most popular architectural style for private homes. It almost kind of feels like you might be living in a cave surrounded by all of this brick and stone and things like that. So it almost feels kind of cold in more ways than one, but some of these examples nevertheless are still present today. And one of the final examples we'll take a look at, this is also in Norwich in downtown, the Carroll Building. This was another design of Stephen Earle's, and I swear it's begging to be rented. It's a beautiful building, highly visible from the Washington Street. So thankfully it still stands. All right, now let's talk a little bit more and wrapping up about the actual Slater Memorial Building. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, this is objectively speaking among Earle's best buildings, if not certainly the best building that he ever designed, because it incorporates all of those elements of the Romanesque revival that make the architectural style so interesting and so important. And you can see pretty much all of those examples on view here, between the rounded archways as well as the rounded arched windows. This feature on the side here, known as a tourelle, is a corbelled turret exposed from the side, as well as the round conical tower that you see in the background here. All of these details, all of the features are just, again, the best expressions of this architectural style. And when the building was designed, the building was realistically designed based on the Athenaeum model at the time. And what that means is that the museum was designed to do three specific things. And that was to uplift a person's mind, body, and spirit. And the building had different areas where those particular goals would be achieved or realized. So a person's mind, for example, would be uplifted here. The Slater Memorial Museum was home to the library here on campus. It was the Peck Library, and located where the Grand Tour exhibition is featured nowadays. So that's where a person's mind would be uplifted with knowledge and information. A person's spirit would be uplifted in the auditorium beneath you with musical performance and dramatic performance. And then a person's body was originally going to be uplifted in the main gallery. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But here's some other images early on of when the museum was first completed. There were classrooms spaced all throughout different parts of the museum. So you might recognize this room nowadays as the gift shop. But back then, this was a very important museum classroom. Studio art space was also prevalent throughout the building. The Norwich Art School, when the art school was founded in 1890, was housed and based in the museum. And so the art classrooms were all contained within this one building. So this picture looking at now is our administrative office spaces, but back then they were all art classrooms. And I love the design of the building because some of the more intricate details of the building are best experienced up close. So if you're looking at the building from much further away, you're not going to see some of these details up close. But when Stephen Earle was designing the building, he made sure that no detail was left untouched or unnoticed. And the masons, the wood carvers, and all of the people involved in constructing this building had a lot of leeway, a lot of freedom in expressing themselves and showing a lot of creativity on the building. So you'll see carvings all throughout the exterior as well as the interior of the building. And of course on the inside as well is where you can see some of the very beautiful wood carvings as well. So some leaf designs and floral designs that you will see. This is all terracotta ornamental features, terracotta being a naturally occurring red clay. And these are some of the animals that you can see in the museum as well. I'll do a quick plug for one of our digital lessons that can be found on Slater Museum's website. If you want to see all of the animals grouped in one location, you can take our virtual zoo tour of the museum, and that is available as a digital lesson on our website, where you get to tour all throughout the outside and the inside of the museum, seeing the different animals such as the owls, the lions, the turtles, and many others. It's really great for young kids too. So if you have young kids or grandkids that are into that sort of thing, I definitely recommend you check that out. There's one of the little crabs and the turtle. And the ornamental fireplace as well, that does feature other carvings of some more mythical creatures. I'll talk a little bit about the wood that was used to create the building. Again, this is another example of how no detail was left unnoticed. The flooring all throughout the museum is comprised of different species of wood. There are several species, and on the main floors, you will find alternating species of wood between hard pine, birch, and maple. And then some rooms had cherry wood bordering the rooms. So these are all very intricate, and in order to either replace or come up with a way of adding new materials to match it, it might be almost impossible to come up with something that truly matches because of the different species that were being used. The gallery that houses the Grand Tour exhibition is another good one to see. The sculpted coffered ceilings, all intricately carved as well. Almost sort of feels like you're within the hull of a ship. That's what a lot of people have said that they would describe it as, sort of like being in the hull of a ship. And I'm going to bring up our virtual tour here to actually show you some of the other features here, because it'll give you a much better view. Excuse me, really quick. Whoops. Let's stop sharing real quick. I'm going to bring up our virtual tour. And for those that are not familiar, we do have a virtual tour of the museum. Some of you may have been familiar with it if you were joining us for our last Zoom presentation. But let me bring it up for you here so that you can see. Just one moment, please. Here we are. So if you go on to slatermuseum.org and you hit that Learn button, you can gain access to our virtual tour. And this gives you a comprehensive look into the inside of the museum. We just had this updated recently. So all of the rooms within the museum are featured here, and it's pretty intuitive as well. You can go through quite literally any room that you want to, again, see all of the different architectural designs and details in the building up close and personal. Let me go to one specific room here so that I can talk about a few of those. Oh. And we're going to go down to the Egyptian section. There we go. The museum had, or I should say, Stephen Earle had procured mosaic tile that was installed in the museum. And so some of you might be familiar with entering the museum through this entrance. This was the original entrance to the museum before the atrium went in 2011 and 2012. So this would have been the main door, the main entrance of the museum coming through. And this is incidentally the only room that features this particular mosaic tile. And if you were to scroll down this way too, you could even navigate through different parts of the museum just by clicking on these location markers, which I think is pretty interesting. All right. So a couple of final factoids before we wrap up. I am keeping a watch on the time, but here's some of the more interesting things about the museum, because you might be wondering, this is an incredibly impressive building. What did it cost? What was the actual cost of the building? Well, I have those figures here for you. The entire building in the 1880s cost $160,000 to build. Now you might think, my goodness, nowadays you couldn't even buy a house for $160,000. But back then, if you adjust for inflation, that's about $3.16 million today. And that sort of and there's some further ways to break that down too. The casts alone, when they were installed, cost $80,000, which would be about $1.5 million. The mosaic tile was budgeted for about $800, and the stained glass as well that you see throughout the building was budgeted at about $300. Nowadays, it'd be almost $7,000. So even again, almost seems like a bargain, doesn't it? It's definitely a much different time back then. As I was going through some of the letters when the museum was first established, I came across one that just made me laugh, and I'll share a abbreviated version with you real quick. Let me go into the cast gallery so that I can show you a little bit. Okay, so some of you might be familiar, some of you might not be familiar with the fact that when the museum was installing these plaster casts, they contracted with a gentleman named Edward Robinson from Boston to select the pieces to cast and install. So he had a lot of communication with Norwich Free Academy and the Slaters and the powers that be when the museum was first being designed. And one of the letters that he wrote to Dr. Robert Porter Keep, who was the head of school at the time, just again shows you the attention to detail that everybody was engaging in with this building. He was writing about how apparently they wanted to make a change to some of the windows, and I'm not sure which windows they were talking about, but Edward Robinson was saying how he basically said, I'm so happy that Mr. Earl is in favor of the changes that we had agreed to. In my opinion, those dormers above the windows are complete dust magnets, and they will just create more work for you to clean them. So they were worrying about the dust coming up on the windows, which again is just really incredible to think about. So that being said, we are just about at 2 o'clock. And I know it's a lot of information that I've thrown at you, but I hope that it was useful and interesting. But we are pretty much at the end now of the program. So I'd like to reserve an opportunity for anybody to ask any questions that they might have, and I'm certainly happy to answer them. So does anybody have any questions that they would like to throw into the chat, or you can unmute yourself and you can ask me that way. Let's get some water here.
Hi, Dayne. This is Katie.
Hi.
I have a quick question about one of the houses that we first saw. I remember distinctly in grade school being taught that the white chimneys with the black feature at the top, the paint at the top, was some sort of loyalist to the crown feature of a home. And I'm wondering if you have also heard of that.
Oh, good question. And I got to be honest with you, I do not know. I am unsure of that. I'd have to find out.
It's a memory that, it stuck with me all these years. I've never researched it. And then I saw it again in your slideshow and wondered if you knew that small, strange, again, obscure fact. I don't know if there's any truth in it.
I'm not sure. I'd have to look it up. I know there are other ways that either that people could identify loyalists during the Rev War period, and And some of them had made their allegiances publicly known. Some of them got chased out of town, but that's a whole separate story. I'll have to look it up now, but I'll have to see. Good question though.
Thank you. Great presentation.
Thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions? And please feel free to throw them into the chat, or you can unmute yourself. I was just seeing some comments come in. Thank you very much to everybody who said they did enjoy the presentation. It's a fascinating building, and it's always just really a pleasure to be able to work here, because buildings themselves are a work of art, and it's always special to work in a place that's an artifact in and of itself. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions. So I'd like to thank you again for joining us today, and I hope you all stay safe and well. We've got a big blizzard coming our way, so hope you all have some snacks and hot chocolate to keep yourselves warm. So thank you again for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much.